What's going on, guys? Today it's kind of cold and rainy outside, so I'm stuck in the studio, but I'm going to give you guys a video on how I edit travel and adventure photos. So I've got a good selection of photos ranging from portraits to landscape photos and different times of day as well, just to give a broad range of different editing styles and different shooting styles. And I'll show you guys how I edit these in Lightroom. Now, this is just my personal photography style and editing style, and I'm not saying this is the only way to edit, of course, but this is the way that I like to do it personally. So let's jump straight into Lightroom and start editing these. Alright, so our first photo is this beetle here driving down the highway, and this is shot in Mount Rainier National Forest in Washington. Really beautiful place. I actually shot this photo through the windshield, and I'm surprised that it's as sharp as it is. So right away I'm seeing it's a little off center here, so I'm going to have to correct that horizon. And overall it's just a little low contrast and low saturation due to it being shot through the car like it was. We're going to fix that horizon really quick. That should be good right there. So I usually start off with the tone curve, and the first thing I'll do is bring up the shadows and bring down the highlights a bit. And what that does is it just fades it a little bit and gives it a nice filmy kind of look. And after that, I'll drag in a little bit of an S-curve, and that just gives it a little contrast. So right away, you can see the image pops a lot more with that tone curve applied. And going into basic, usually I'll just turn down the highlights, bring up the shadows just to give it a little more dynamic range, and bring up the whites, bring down the blacks, and then I'll give it a little bit of vibrance and turn down the saturation just a bit. Notice it's a little cool, so we're going to bring up that white balance a little, but that's looking pretty good for the tone. And now let's just move into the HSL. And I really like this yellow stripe on the road and the red of the car, so we're going to just bump the saturation and luminance for those two colors. And that's just going to make that pop a little more. And it's looking pretty good. Just on and off, really subtle change. And one more thing I want to do to this photo is bring out this road a little more. So we're going to take our adjustment brush and just paint that road. Just going to give it a little bit of clarity and a little bit of exposure and a little contrast. Just going to kind of bring that out a little bit more than it was. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty close. So there's the before and after right there. Just kind of overall a little bit brighter, a little higher contrast. So let's move on to our next photo. This is a night photo I took in Colorado. This is actually a really cool campsite. We were camping right here, and I just pretty much just got up and just took this photo straight from our campsite, which is awesome. So with night photography, I usually start off with the tone and white balance of the photo. So it's a little bright. I'm going to turn down that exposure a bit, and I'm also going to bring that white balance down so it's a little bluer. This is just personal preference. That looks about right. Bring that tint up a little bit more. And then what I like to do is drag those highlights down and then bring the whites up. And that really makes the stars pop a lot more in your photo. And I'll do the same for the blacks. Kind of bring the shadows up and bring the blacks down. And then we're going to go to vibrance and bring that up a little bit more. Maybe adjust that tint a bit. Yeah, and that's looking pretty good already. What I'm trying to do with night photography is I'll usually want to make those stars pop, and the stars are going to be the brightest parts of the image. So you really want to bring up those whites as much as you can without really blowing out your photo. And then kind of similar to what I did in the last one, I'll just do that same tone curve, kind of just bringing up the shadows, bringing down the highlights, and just making a gentle sort of S-curve. So that's looking pretty good. I'm just going to go into lens corrections and just enable profile corrections. That'll just kind of get rid of that vignetting that we've got going on in the corners there. Yeah, and that's looking pretty good. That's pretty much how I would edit that photo. So here's the before and after on this image, so quite a bit of difference on this. I usually go pretty heavy on my night photography edits. So moving on, this is a portrait I took, and this should be a relatively quick edit. So usually I just start off with that tone curve again and just kind of give it the same look we've been doing in the previous photos. But this time I'm just going to drag up those highlights a little bit more, give it a little brightness, and we're going to go into basic and just drag up that exposure a bit because I like really bright portraits. And then what I like to do is drag those blacks up and bring the shadows down, which gives it kind of a softer look to the photo. And I kind of like that. And doing the same for the highlights, we're going to bring the highlights up and the whites down. Then I'll just bring up the vibrance a little bit. I'll just go into HSL and do a few minor adjustments. I'm going to bring those yellows a little bit more towards orange, just so it kind of matches a little more. And also bring the greens a little bit more towards yellow. I don't really want to adjust the orange or red too much because that'll affect your skin tones. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. I don't really need to do too much else to this photo. So there's the before, that's the after. So moving on, here's a photo I took at Blue Hour in Colorado. So I got these guys canoeing down towards their campsite. Thought it was a really cool photo. Got the fire going on here. So right away, what I'm going to do is crop this because there's a little bit of dead space on the left here. So I'm going to want to crop it just kind of so all the action is kind of more balanced in the photo. Got the canoe here, got the tent off to the left. All right, so we'll go into the tone curve, do the S curve here, and then go into basic and just bring up that exposure a bit. And then we're gonna go and drag a gradient over the sky just because that's a little bright here, and just bring that exposure down for the sky. That'll kind of balance it out a little more. And then I'm just gonna wanna bring out the brightest highlights in the reflection in the canoe here. So I'm gonna bring up the white slider, and that's just gonna give it a little more contrast. Do the same for the blacks here. And then bring up the vibrance just a little bit. Bring down the saturation. It's kind of giving a kind of a film look here. I'm not really going to mess with the white balance because I like the blue colors. This was shot at Blue Hour, so it's pretty natural. And then one thing that I like to do sometimes is go into split toning and just bring in a little bit of reds into the shadows. So if you hold down Option and you drag the hue, you can see all the different colors. And I'll usually drag it towards somewhere around the yellows or oranges, sometimes red. And I just kind of feel like it gives a nice vintage kind of look to the images. And I usually try not to overdo this look. Yeah, so that's looking pretty good. Moving on, this is a shot in Bryce Canyon. This is my sister just exploring the canyons. I thought this was a really cool shot. It was kind of a fun area just to walk around in and check out the canyon. Right away, I noticed that these rocks, in real life, they were like really bright red and orange, and it's kind of subdued in this photo. So I'm going to really work on trying to bring out those colors in this photo. So I'm going to bring up that vibrance and saturation here, and then move the white balance a little bit towards the yellows and tint a little bit towards magenta. And right away, that's just going to bring out the colors in the rocks a little bit more. And we're going to adjust the tone a little bit, bring down those highlights so you can see a little bit more detail in the sky. And then bring up the shadows so you can see a little bit more in the foreground. And before we do anything else, I'll just straighten this up a little bit. And then going into tone curve again, we're just going to do that same thing. Bring up the shadows, do an S curve, and bring down those highlights, just kind of giving it a nice faded look. I'm just going to go into split toning and give it a little bit of yellow orange in the shadows. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. That's the before and after right there. So you can see I brought a little more detail into the sky and really brought out the color in the greens and reds in the rocks. So moving on to our next shot. This was shot in Washington on the coast, and we were actually camping on the beach here. Super cool location. And I thought that was a kind of a cool shot with the sun coming through the rocks here. So right away you can see it's pretty bright in the highlights and pretty dark in the shadows. You can't really see much detail on these rocks here. So I'm going to bring up the shadows just so you can see a little bit more in there, and bring down the highlights. And then we're going to bring up that white balance a little bit because it's a little cool for a sunset photo. We're going to bring up the vibrance a little bit and then go into tone curve. You know what to do. Just bring up those shadows, bring down the highlights, and make an S curve in there. So yeah, I'd say this photo is pretty good. So moving on to the next one. This one was shot at Mount St. Helens in Washington. And this is the visitor center actually, which is like this really cool steep sloped building just so the snow would like run off the roof. But it's got this really cool Alpine look, and I kind of liked it with the mountains in the background and kind of framed by these Alpine trees. So right away, just looking at this photo, it's really high contrast. So it's pretty dark in the shadows and really bright up in those highlights. So we're going to go into the basic tab and just turn down the highlights pretty far. So now you can see a lot more detail in those clouds, and bring up the shadows so you can see a little bit more of the trees. Bring down the blacks a little bit maybe. I want to find a balance where there's a little bit of shadow in the trees, but you can still kind of see into them. We're going to go into temperature and just make it a little bit warmer. Go in and just give it a little bit of vibrance. I'll go into tone curve and just do that same thing I did in my previous photos. Give it that S curve, kind of a faded look. And then I'll just go into split toning, and I just want to give it a little bit of red in the shadows. A lot of times I'll give it some red in the shadows for forest scenes because the red and green kind of go well together. But yeah, I'd say that's pretty good. There's the before and after on that one. And for our final shot, this one was taken at the Grand Canyon. And there's a little bit of a storm coming in. It's kind of hard to see in this photo, but there's some rain clouds up here. So I'm going to try to bring those out a bit. First, I'm going to give us a 4:5 crop because I don't really like the foreground so much. So we're going to crop it up higher so we can see more of the clouds and less of the foreground. And then just going to try to bring out those clouds a bit. We're going to drag in a gradient and just turn down the exposure and bring up the clarity, contrast. So just kind of play with that and make the clouds and rain up there pop. So that's pretty good. In this photo, we're actually going to go black and white. We're going to try that, and then we're going to bring up the whites, bring down the blacks. A lot of times when I go black and white, I like to really give it a lot of contrast. And then of course we're going to go into tone curve again and pretty much do the same thing. Then I'm going to go into effects and just give it a little bit of grain. With black and whites especially, I kind of like that grainy sort of look. Kind of gives it a more vintage, kind of filmy kind of look. So there's the before and after there. So you can see a lot more contrast. You can kind of see a lot more in the rain showers up here. Yeah, that's all I've got for you today. Hope you guys got a little bit out of this video, kind of how I like to edit my photos. Obviously you don't have to edit your stuff the same way that I do, but this is just what works for me and what I like to do personally. So yeah, if you guys like this video, give me a subscribe, and I will see you on the channel next week.